At work, we sometimes use a click to edit user experience in which a value is provided to the user, and then if the user goes to click on that value, you can see that we now show an edit form for it, and I can then edit and save, and you can see that that value is now persisted. I'm not a huge fan of this type of interaction. I feel like it has significant discoverability issues and some accessibility issues, right? I don't know that I can click this necessarily. But that said, we do use it, so I wanted to look at a couple of different approaches and pros and cons to implementing the click to edit functionality in Angular 9. So to do this, I have three different approaches here, and what we can see is in my app component, I'm just grabbing a list of projects and I'm breaking out the three different implementations into their own individual components, and you can see I'm just piping projects into that list. I'm not going to worry about unidirectional data flow or events at this level. As you can see, I save it here and it is added to all the other things. So we don't have to worry about that level. But let's take a look now at the different approaches. So first, let's look at approach one. Approach one uses what I would call a globally reusable edit component. So you can see here I'm looping over my list of projects, and inside my list I just have this editable component. I'm passing in the value that I want to display and the event handler for when that value is changed. And internally to this editable component, let's look at that, you can see internally to the editable component, it controls its own internal state. Here's the editing state with the input, the save, and the cancel, and then here's the non-editing state where we're just showing the value. And the logic here is actually pretty simple. All we do is emit some values when they change. We have to deal with a pending value once the user clicks, but ultimately it's fairly straightforward. And then the calling context, you can see, has its own value change, in which case we're just persisting that new name back into the project. So clearly approach one works, right? We have test two, you can save, and you can see that gets persisted. However, I think this is a terrible approach. And the reason I think it's a terrible approach is because I think it's what Sandy Metz might refer to as the wrong abstraction. Here we're trying to create a globally reusable, editable functionality, but really I think that's solving the wrong problem. And in fact has a host of issues associated with it. For example, what if I wanted to change the wording of the save button or the wording of the cancel, or I wanted to remove the cancel, or I wanted to change some of the styling here. Not to mention, you can see I can actually edit multiples of these at the same time. What if I didn't want to allow that? What would happen is I would have to start to add a whole bunch of attributes to this component to allow it to be highly customizable. And as this component surface area would grow, its maintainability might become a nightmare over time because you'd be so afraid to change something without breaking another part of the application. And that's because, again, I think it's trying to solve the wrong problem. So let's take a look at the second approach, which is the inline editing approach. And just to demonstrate my best project, right? This works, everything gets persisted. Now what you will see is that I am actually able to customize the look and feel here. I have a dark button, I have a red cancel, which contrast it with this. I don't have any of that ability to customize. I have some better padding here on the input. So how does that work? So the approach 2 essentially takes everything that we didn't like about approach 1 and tries to overcome it by inlining all of the functionality in approach 2. So here in approach 2, as I'm looping over my projects, whereas I would have had just a simple component to install, essentially you can see I'm taking all of the logic from in that component and I'm merging that directly into the calling context. So you can see here my loop has to include the editor for the inputs, and then the read-only version for the static value. I have to deal with keeping track of both the pending value as well as the selected project, and I have to add all of the event handlers and all that stuff. Now, the benefit of this added complexity is that I now have complete control, right? I have direct access to the input, the button, the cancel link. I can remove this if I wanted to. I can change the wording. I can change the styling, and so on and so forth. And the complexity of the code behind is not terribly different. We have to keep track again of the pending value and the selected project, but for the most part, the code itself is fairly easy. The real problem with this, in my opinion, is that the readability of the HTML just decreases by let's call it a non-trivial amount. There's a lot of noise here for something that's not necessarily adding value all the time. So that brings me to approach 3, which is a mixed editing approach, meaning it's somewhat in line but somewhat encapsulated. And just again to demonstrate that this all works, right? It gets persisted. So how does this version work? In this version, we're sort of splitting the difference. Here in my projects list, I still have a component that encapsulates a lot of the low-level functionality, but you can see that it is not encapsulating the read-only version or the static version. So I'm explicitly saying if this is the selected project, so I have to keep track of which project is being selected for editing, then show the editor form, otherwise show the read-only or the static version. So the complexity of the calling context is slightly increased, right? We have to have these two different states here, and we have to keep track of our selected project, right? The code behind is relatively unchanged from version 2, approach 2. And I'm defining this approach 3 editor in the same file. Now, typically, I wouldn't do it in the same file, but I'm doing it in this demo to drive home the fact that this is not, I repeat, not a globally reusable component. This component is forever tied to approach 3, which means that we still get all of the same direct access to the inputs, the buttons, the cancels, the styling, the low-level interactions that we did in approach 2. We're just taking that and wrapping it up in something that's a little bit easier to read in the calling context. But you can see that if we scroll down to this component, it's now handling the pending values and worrying about emitting. So it's using a unidirectional data flow at the low level and then relying on the calling context to persist that data. And again, one of the nice things about this, if we just recap from approach 1, one of the bad things is that it's hard to maintain consistency, or if we wanted to limit that. But now, because I have a selected project value, you can see that essentially clicking into another one implicitly calls cancel on the other one, so to speak. It's not actually cancel, it's just not rendering that version. And this is my favorite approach. I think that it is a nice mixture of complexity and separation of concerns, which I think will lead to the best maintainability over time. I like the fact very much that this is an encapsulation, but it's not an encapsulation that is trying to solve too many problems, right? I'm not trying to solve the how do I implement click to edit across my entire application, which again I think is the wrong abstraction. This is solving the how do I implement most of the click to edit functionality in this particular use case, which allows me to have complete control over the UI, including customized buttons, styling, verbiage, and so on and so forth, without having to make this component like infinitely flexible, because it doesn't have to be used in an infinite number of places. It has to be used in 1, maybe 2 places. And that means that a lot of what would have normally been flexibility can actually be baked in to the underlying implementation constructs. So again, this mixed editing approach tends to be my favorite approach, though I would happily use the inline editing approach, which, just to recap here, is essentially taking the edit version and just merging it directly into the calling context, right? Merging it directly into the list. I would happily use this approach in a simple context. The only thing that I would strongly object to is trying to encapsulate the idea of click to edit in a way that can be globally reusable. Again, I think that's the wrong abstraction. I think you're solving the wrong problem when you do that. And trying to create this infinitely flexible component is only going to come back to haunt you and make maintainability much more difficult in the long run. At least that's my opinion. So hopefully some of this is interesting. And like I said, I'm not a huge fan of this type of interaction. I think it has discoverability problems, not to mention like screen real estate issues. Like, what if I want this edit form to be more significant? I don't know. You kind of paint yourself into a corner when you try to do it with a click to edit. But anyway, there's that. Hopefully this is interesting.